Thank you. This is overwhelming, in a good way, not a bad way. First, I want to thank Dr. Phyllis Thompson and the Women's Studies program for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to be here, and I want to thank all of you for being here, all of you, because I know the beginning of the semester is a really busy time. You know, I had a few thoughts in my head, like, why did I even say that I would do this at the beginning of the semester? But it's great. And you all made it here today, and I made it here today, and that's wonderful. So I wanted to thank you just for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. So my talk is Mindset Matters. That much you probably know, but maybe you don't know what you're going to get into after this. We're going to focus on the role of grit and mindset and how that relates to self-efficacy. I'm going to talk about a study that I conducted that was specific to the helping professions, and I focused on professional counselors. But I'm going to try to branch out a little bit and open the discussion later in the talk to how this might apply to different areas of your professional or personal life. So they always tell you to give an outline of what you're going to talk about. Okay, well, I'll do that. But I'm not going to read you what it says up there. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey, how I got to be so passionate and love grit and mindset so much that I wanted to study it and talk to you about it today. And so I'll talk a little bit about my journey. I'll talk about some key terms that are really important as we start this discussion. And then I'm going to go into the researchy stuff, so I'll lose some of you along the way. And I know that, and that's okay. But there are a lot of people in this room that care about the research part. So I'm going to hit the highlights. We're short on time today. We have limited time. So I'm going to just, like I said, hit the high points. If you're interested about some of the things, we can talk about it later. You can get in touch with me. And then I'm going to bring it back. So you'll know when it's time to come back, the people I lost. I'll reel you back in, and we're going to talk about the application of how this applies in different areas. I'm going to talk about the conclusions of my study and what you can take out of today. Does that sound good? Okay. So I see some familiar faces in the room, and my students will appreciate that my story begins with a TED Talk. Yeah, I love TED Talks, and I get made fun of for it. But this is Sean Aker, and he's presenting a TED Talk on positive psychology. And in one segment of the talk, he has this graph on the big screen in front of him. And it's a regression line, and so all these dots are on the regression line, and they signify participants, and they fall a certain amount above and below the line. That's normal, right? And then there's this person way at the top, this outlier. And, you know, researchers say, like, we want to delete the outliers because they're messing up my data, you know, skewing my line one way or the other. And instead, he says, you know, I think we should study those outliers. If we're looking at achievement, what is that person doing that is they're excelling above and beyond what is expected? What is the normal range that they should be in? So that piqued my interest. It was the first thing that I was like, oh, that's interesting, right? The outliers. So I wanted to know what that factor was that would help people excel more than others, given the same set of intelligence, circumstances, ability, people still excel at different rates, okay? So I found this in other areas of my life too. I've been in sports my entire life, and I realized that not just myself, but other people, it wasn't just natural ability that got me where I wanted to be in sports. In the classroom, you know, I was an average student in high school. Wasn't anything, you know, like I wasn't the head of my class, nothing like that. But as I go through graduate school, and then I pursue a doctoral degree, and I see other people doing the same thing, having similar stories, I still am asking myself the same question. What is that? What is that factor? Because at this point, it's not just intelligence. Anybody who's gone through it knows that won't get you all the way through most of the time. So I wanted to know, what is that? So then I came across this term, grit. And I was like, that's it. The light bulb went off. It finally fit for me. So grit is defined as the passion and perseverance for long-term goals. And And then I started digging a little deeper. By this time, I was a professional counselor, and I'm trying to start some research stuff. And as I was looking at the literature, this other word popped up, mindset, the view you adopt for yourself, that traits like intelligence or other traits are either fixed or malleable. So we all kind of have this view, it's either one or the other. And so when I really started putting my research together, I wanted to look at a problem. Like I said, at this time I was a practicing counselor, and I wanted to identify a problem in the field, and burnout was that problem. The literature was staggering, the rates of burnout in the human services counseling profession. And so burnout is defined as a prolonged response to chronic emotional and interpersonal stressors in the workplace, and it can impact us in a variety of ways. I'm not going to focus on burnout during this presentation, but I want you to know that it was one of the factors I wanted to test outcomes of burnout. So I knew I wanted to look at burnout. I knew I was in love with the concepts of grit and mindset, but I needed something to bridge the gap. Nobody had ever looked at grit or mindset in the realm of counseling before. Nobody was talking about it. They were talking about it in psychology or educational literature, but they weren't really talking about it in counseling. So then I looked at the relationship between burnout and counselor self-efficacy, and counselor self-efficacy was the bridge. It's your belief in your ability to perform a given task. In my study, I looked at counselor self-efficacy specifically, which is a counselor's belief in their ability to perform a certain way and get desired outcomes. So these were all the pieces to my puzzle. Then I had to figure out, well, how do these all fit together? So I'm going to go into 3 of these in more detail. First, grit is an individual's effort and persistence in overcoming difficulties. Now, the important part here is that it can promote a more positive mindset, so you can start to hear similar terms being linked, and greater self-efficacy. So I was like, oh, I'm really onto something here, right? There's also a moderate positive relationship between grit and growth mindset. That's how I came to the term mindset to begin with. And developing a growth mindset could develop grit. So this is also very important because grit isn't just you have it or you don't. It's something that you can change, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. One of the leading questions in the grit research is, why are some people more successful than others? Like I said, given the same set of circumstances, intelligence, ability, people still excel at different rates. So talent, people often say talent or intelligence. That's the typical answer. And instead, like I said, grit came out of the literature. It was the it factor that kind of pushed people to excel beyond their talent and abilities alone. There are a lot of talented individuals. You may know people that are super intelligent or super talented and really don't use it. So there are a lot of people that set goals and don't follow through with them. So there are things that hold those people back. The second term I want to talk about is mindset. So I'm going to talk about Carol Dweck like she's my best friend, okay? If that's okay with you. When you read something that somebody has ever written, it's like you have a personal relationship with them. So Carol Dweck is my friend. Carol Dweck is the leading researcher on mindset, and she has over 20 years of research in this area. When she started, she developed the implicit theories of intelligence, and it's the view you adopt for yourself. There are 2 parts to this. The incremental theory of intelligence is that you believe that those characteristics can change. That's what she later refers to as growth mindset. And then you have the entity theory of intelligence, which is the belief that I have a certain amount of skill and ability, and that remains relatively stable over time. That's what she refers to later as a fixed mindset. In addition to her implicit theories of intelligence, she talks about 2 response patterns, and this means a response to adversity or challenges, and 2 types of goals. The two response patterns are mastery-oriented, so that means when I come up against adversity or challenges, I'm going to take this as an opportunity to learn and grow and become better at something than I ever imagined that I could be. It's not even something I ever thought that I could do. So that's a mastery-oriented response. Or you have a helpless response, which is you kind of butt up against something that challenges you, and you just kind of take a step back and say, no, that's not for me. I'm not that smart, I'm not that skilled in that area, so I'm just going to do what I know. There are also two types of goals. People set learning goals in order to force themselves beyond the capacities that they know that they have. So if I know I'm this good at something or I'm this smart, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to choose something totally different that's out of my comfort zone, and I'm going to push myself to go there. On the other hand, there are achievement goals that are put in place to accomplish things that we know that we're good at. If I know I'm good at something and I put myself in a situation where I'm going to be successful, then that's a good confidence booster. So she doesn't really talk about these as good or bad, but they just kind of are ways that we interact with the world and that we respond to things that happen in our life. And so one last thing that I want to say is that she points out that achievement goals are typically associated with a helpless response pattern and more of a fixed mindset. And you can guess the other one. Learning goals are typically associated with people that have a more mastery-oriented response and a growth mindset. So I want to give you two examples. Carol Dweck wrote a book in 2006. It was published. It's called Mindset. Surprise. And she uses a lot of sports examples to illustrate her points. Lots of sports examples. So two of the sports examples that really stuck out to me were Michael Jordan and John McEnroe. Michael Jordan got cut from his high school varsity basketball team and went on to become one of the NBA's greatest basketball players of all time. After getting cut, it wasn't just talent that took him as far as he went. He has a book, you can read it. He put hours and hours into practice. After practice, he pushed himself and kept pushing and persevered over every obstacle he ever faced. He also has a quote that you may have heard before, and he talks about how many shots he's missed, how many games he's lost, and that he fails over and over again in his life, and that is why he succeeds. Carol Dweck talks about, she says that Michael Jordan he exemplifies the growth mindset. On the other hand, if you know anything about tennis or John McEnroe, you know that he's known for kind of being somewhat unhinged. He's has always had problems with anger management when he played and always had excuses for everything. He would miss a shot or lose a match, and it was just always somebody else's fault. It was too sunny, the sun was in my eyes, the racket was slippery, whatever it was always somebody else's fault. And even though he was very successful in his career, Carol Dweck says that this is more of a fixed mindset. The last term that I want to go over in some detail is self-efficacy. And it's not just about the knowledge and skills that we know we have, but the perception of, in a given situation, what am I going to do with that knowledge and skills? Can I perform the duties necessary to accomplish the task? And so that's an important takeaway point. The literature shows that counselor self-efficacy is negatively related to burnout and anxiety, meaning the higher the self-efficacy, the less burnout, the less anxiety. And also, it's positively associated with performance and job satisfaction. So as the counselor self-efficacy increases, so does the performance and the job satisfaction. So I had all of these pieces, and then I had to figure out, what do I want to know? And then I developed some research questions. My first question was, to what extent does counselor self-efficacy predict reduced burnout? This is something that the literature was pretty clear about. Remember, this was my foundation. And I'm going into the researchy stuff, so just beware. Okay. that was pretty clear, that there was going to be a relationship there, and it was going to be fairly strong. The second question was, does mindset and grit affect counselor self-efficacy? So this is where I started to bridge the gap a little bit. And the final question was, to what extent is the relationship between mindset and counselor self-efficacy mediated through grit? So the literature pointed to a relationship between mindset and counselor self-efficacy, but I didn't really know exactly where grit fit into the mix. And so I thought that that first relationship was influenced by grit somehow. And so the best way to describe this was to create a model of how all of these variables work together. So what I did, I started with burnout. That's what I knew. I knew I wanted to look at a problem in the field of counseling. Burnout was that problem. And I told you I was pretty confident about the relationship between burnout and counselor self-efficacy. So then I kind of went backwards, and I said, well, the literature points to also counselor self-efficacy being influenced by mindset. But then grit might be working with mindset and with counselor self-efficacy at the same time. So what I was going to do was run some correlations and control for different variables to see how much was grit influencing mindset and counselor self-efficacy, that relationship. And so that's what I did. My survey design was, my research design was pretty simple. It was quantitative, pretty straightforward. I had 57 questions on my survey. 164 surveys were started, but only 148 were completed. And 12 had significant missing data that had to be removed. Some people just started and didn't finish at all. So my final sample size was 136, and there was still some missing data in certain questions, and so some analyses were ran with 132 participants. I asked some basic demographic information just to learn about my sample a little bit and see if anything jumped out. But the rest of the 4 scales that were used were pre-existing scales that had really strong psychometrics. They were reliable and valid. And so I just put those all together in a survey, and it was an online questionnaire through Qualtrics. So when I got my data and I started doing some analyses, something jumped out at me initially that I had to deal with. The distribution was extremely skewed when it came to mindset. Only 5 out of 132 participants were identified as having a fixed mindset. And so there's an assumption of normality that your scores have to be pretty equally distributed. And so I had to do something to redistribute those scores and show what was really happening here. Because what was happening was not necessarily fixed and growth, but this was different levels of growth-mindedness. These counselors in my study, were fairly growth-minded. Or all had some level of growth-mindedness. So I recategorized them all into low, medium, or high. And it's important to note that in the low category, that was low to 0. So those 5 participants who were identified as having a fixed mindset would have been included in the low category. So this is just a shot of how they were redistributed, and then you can see they were fairly equal after that. So then I want to just address each research question that I presented to you already and the results of each individually. The first research question was, does counselor self-efficacy predict reduced burnout? And what I found was exactly what I expected to find, was that it was a moderate to strong negative relationship, meaning the increase in counselor self-efficacy predicts a reduced increase in burnout. And that was a statistically significant finding. The second question was, does mindset and grit affect counselor self-efficacy? And for this question, I had to run 2 different correlations to figure that out. The first one was mindset and counselor self-efficacy, and it was a small to moderate positive relationship, but it was statistically significant. And the second one was grit and counselor self-efficacy, and it had just about the same relationship. Small to moderate positive relationship that was also statistically significant. The final question was the mediation that I talked about. So this is when controlling for grit, was that correlation impacted in any way to prove that grit was really influencing the relationship between mindset and counselor self-efficacy? And the correlation was reduced, but it was still significant. So in a mediation model, whenever you're doing those multiple correlations and you're controlling for variables, for it to be a full mediation, that number has to be reduced enough that it's not significant anymore. That means that that other variable was really accounting for everything that was going on, or the majority of what was going on in that first relationship. So this was reduced, which means something's going on. But whenever you have a mediation, you have to see if that number, you have to run another test to see if the reduction was significant, and it was not. So this is a visual of all of my results with correlation coefficients, and you can see where the stars represent significance. And so the counselor self-efficacy and burnout was the most significant finding in the study. But everything else was significant, which says that there are relationships between these variables. It's important to remind you that this was the first study in the counseling world to really start talking about grit and mindset. So if nothing else, I proved that these are things that maybe we should be talking about. Maybe this wasn't the exact model that fit these variables perfectly, but it's a start. And in research, you have to start somewhere. So the conclusions that came out of my study, one thing I didn't anticipate finding, but I did, was that the vast majority of counselors are growth-minded, at least the participants in my study. And I'd be curious to see if that extends beyond my study. Also, the relationship between counselor self-efficacy and burnout supports previous literature. So that's also important. I wanted to start with a good foundation. I wanted to see if something that already I knew existed was true, and if I could build on that, and that's exactly what I did. And then the last finding was that there is some relationship present between mindset, grit, and counselor self-efficacy. And like I said, this model may not be exactly accurate of how all of those variables interact, but the fact that they were all significant says something. So if I lost you in the researchy stuff, you can come back now, because we're done with the researchy stuff. And if you loved the researchy stuff and you have more questions about it, we can talk about that after, or you can find me after. And I'd be happy to talk to you about that. So the next thing that I want to do, and I apologize because I didn't anticipate this turnout, is I want to give you an opportunity to take the grit scale. And that's one of the assessments that I used in my study. Because I promised in my little write-up here that you would get to do some self-assessment. And so I need to preface this, though, because one of my initial concerns when researching grit, and before I kind of knew about mindset, was, well, what if I'm not gritty? Like, that stinks, you know? But it's not like that, and I don't want anybody to leave here feeling like they just don't got it. So I want to preface this by saying this is a self-assessment tool. It's used for self-exploration. If you get a score that you're a little disappointed in, just know, go back to the mindset stuff, that you make an intentional change in your goal setting or your response patterns, and you can change your grit. So don't have a fixed mindset about it, okay? So if you reflect on your score, right, and you're not where you want to be, maybe do some self-reflection about, remember, this is like long-term goals. So if I'm setting goals and I'm not really getting there, what is stopping me? When I come up against a challenge or adversity, what do I do? What is my response pattern? If you are where you want to be, then good for you. What are you doing right? What can you keep doing to keep setting learning goals and growing more than you believed you ever could? So the takeaway is nothing negative here, but it's just self-reflection, okay? And if you have questions about your score, we can talk about that a little bit. How am I doing on time? Okay, great. Yeah, if you would, I really don't have enough. I think I printed 40. For anyone who may not get the opportunity to get one, this is available online. You can Google it and it will come up. It's the 12-item grit score. Just get the PDF version. All right, so it should only take you about 5 minutes to fill that out. Are you done? You can start scoring it then. Use that to score it. Okay, start scoring it. Are you done? You done?
Like you're gonna keep on trying.
Start scoring it. That's how you score it. Did you do yours? Okay. That's the scoring sheet. Yep.
We can share that. We can.
You're welcome.
Did you want us to pass these up when we're done?
No, you can score it. So after you're done, there's a self-scoring sheet. Make sure you get one so you know what your answers mean. You get one? Did you give it away?
Yeah, I passed it.
We're just sharing.
Okay, yeah, you can share the scoring sheet. Pass some of these down. Okay. Can you share?
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you two share this? Can you all share this? Okay.
This one's an 8 question.
Can you share that? Here, pass these down. There's a short one.
If anyone's finished, I can.
I'm easily distracted, so let's finish.
Are you done with your scoring sheet? No. Okay. Did you get it? Do you need help?
Oh, we're sharing a pen.
Okay. Oh, here. There you go. Look at that. This is full service here. Okay, great. Anybody else need a scoring sheet? Are you done? Okay. All right, so once you finish, you should have a number between 1 and 5. Anybody need this? Do you need this? Got it? Okay. you get your number?
I did. I'm pretty good.
Yeah, thank you. All right, about 2 more minutes. Try to finish up getting your score. You're off the scale. I mean, I never heard of that stuff, but maybe. Your number should be between 1 and 5. Where's my kazoo when I need it? Reel people back in. All right. If I could have your attention, I know some people are still finishing up, but if I could have the majority of people back. I don't want to just give you that and leave that hanging. So, does anybody have questions about the assessment, about their score? What's that?
So can you have a growth mindset and low grit?
Yeah, you can. I would say it's more atypical, but you can, because they're not one and the same. Do you feel like that? It fits for you? Yeah? Growth mindset, low grit. Yeah? Yeah, you can. They're 2 different scores. We didn't do the mindset measure today, but there is a mindset measure for mindset. So you can take that maybe. It's online too, and see what that looks like. But they're 2 different scores, so they can be different. It's typically higher grit is typically associated with more of a growth mindset and vice versa, but that's not always the case. That's a good question though, thank you. Yeah?
If you're moderately like in the 3 range, is it kind of like up in the air where your mindset would, usually lie with it being growth or fixed?
Yeah, they're not, like I said, they're not like hand in hand. So you can take both assessments and kind of see where you fall, and together, those may give you a bigger, a more broad picture. Yeah. But that's about an average grit score, 3 to 3.5. Yeah.
How do you improve your grit?
Mindset. That's an easy question. You have to make an intentional change in one of the areas of mindset. So whether it's different types of goal setting, those learning goals, pushing yourself beyond what you know you're capable of, or having a more mastery-oriented response to failure or adversity. If you have more of a helpless response pattern, just think about that for a second. If I keep coming up against challenges and plateaus in my progress, and my response pattern is helpless, well, I'm just not going to try that anymore. Well, then you may never get to that long-term goal. So the change really happens in the mindset and the intentionality behind that. Part of it is mindfulness. So being aware what kind of response pattern we're having in those moments, or what kind of goals are we setting? Do we set goals really just to be successful? Because we can do that. It's a good confidence booster. And sometimes we may need to do just that. We all know, like you get in those slumps and you just have to know, I'm good at something. And so they both serve a purpose. But if you're feeling like you're in a place where you don't want to be, then maybe you need to focus more on learning goals and a mastery-oriented response. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So is a mastery-oriented response, I can do it? Or is it, if I change this one aspect of my technique, I'm going to be able to succeed with this task?
I think it's both. I think it's both. I think it's the thought behind it and it's the action. Because you can't just think you can do it. You have to have that belief, that self-efficacy that plays into mindset, but you also have to do it. You have to put yourself in situations where you're gonna be challenged. And you may not be successful in the way that you expect to be. But as long as you know that you will learn and grow and change from that experience, then that is the mastery-oriented response. Other questions about the assessment or the scores? Okay, so I want to open this up a little bit for discussion since we have a little bit of time. But I want to just remind you that the application for me was very much about self-exploration. So being able to assess how I'm answering these, am I where I want to be? Am I falling into kind of a pattern where I'm just doing what I know I'm good at and I'm staying there because it's comfortable? But also that mindset influences grit. So it's, if you're not where you want to be, make one of those changes in the goal setting or the response pattern. But I want to hear a little bit about what you took from today. Where do you think that this can apply in your life or in your professional arena? Because I know my study was specific to counselors, but not everybody is in that type of role. Yeah.
Because I'm doing my capstone on burnout, but I'm doing it on the helping professions, not a particular one. Most of mine has to deal with social workers. And I haven't used the your term, but what I'm finding out is that along the way, the social workers that tend to push their work off on other people and don't, I guess, put the extra effort into it, seem to be more susceptible to burnout than the social worker that takes all the work on themselves. Now, they have to use a good self-care resume not to burn out, but that there is that correlation between the idea of that you can do it and you will do it, and the ones that just say, I've done my work today, this extra client came in, now I'm not going to do it. And they seem to be the ones that, as you're saying, tend to burn out more easily and leave the profession. Because what I'm trying to do is try to figure out ways to help keep our professionals in our profession, because once they're burned out, they're pretty much useless to us as professionals.
Right. They shouldn't be practicing with burnout.
They can't continue, and they're not doing their clients or anyone else anyway.
Right.
So as I said, most of mine is to look for ways to prevent my burnout, but a lot of what your studies show is basically the same thing I'm finding.
Right, and I think that's kind of where I started, is wanting to assess how can we catch burnout before it gets to be burnout. And so one of the things that I was looking at was, as hopefully one of my outcomes, is can we use this in training programs to do early assessment and see where people fall in these areas. And there may be some people that need a little more support, and if we can do early intervention, right? I wanted it to be more of a preventative approach. And I think the self-assessment, can be part of that in supervision and training. So yeah, we're on the same page. Different language, but yeah. Okay, my colleagues here.
So what does passion fall into all of this?
Passion?
Yeah, because I see correlations between
having a passion for something in grit as well?
It's in grit, so remember the definition, passion and perseverance for long-term goals. So she very much incorporates that in what being gritty means. You have to have, there are two parts, and I didn't include this, effort and interest. And so you have to remain full of interest in something over a long period, and you have to maintain that effort over the long period. So that's the passion part. Because if you don't have one or the other of those, you are going to just kind of give up or take a different direction. So staying the course takes that passion, the effort, and the interest. Jana, did you have a question?
I was just thinking that given the impact of mindset and so forth, and that there can be changes that will affect grit, I was thinking about that in terms of freshman 10-20 class and the Puzzles of Life class and involving some of these things and even promoting activities that instead of the idea that, you know, don't do something unless you're good at it, to actually go out and try to do something that you don't know you can do and what you can learn from that and build in activities to promote some of those things.
Yes, this is definitely one of my areas that I'm interested in pursuing, is understanding situations that we can put, especially students in, that will foster these qualities and help them if they are feeling like, you know, life happens and these life changes happen, and that can sometimes be overwhelming and really produce a lot of self-doubt. Am I doing what I really want to be doing? Am I where I want to be? And that's one of the areas in working with students that I want to kind of learn a little bit more about.
And to that point with grit, if passion is important, you can find out, I'm focusing on something I have no interest in, that I'm not passionate about this, which can get into a lot of why am I doing this, society influence,
Right.
parental influence, which could actually maybe open the door to maybe doing the things that you want to be doing.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
I'm actually a Buccaneer Involvement Guide of one of the freshman 10-20 classes. How would you present to a freshman to make changes for their mindset in their grit to kind of be able, because like they've just gone from a high school where it's like, oh, I was the quarterback of the football team, or
Right.
I was just a nerd, I don't know what to do. How would you present to a freshman of like, not necessarily like the research aspect, but hey, have you thought about blank to kind of make that change?
Yeah, I think education is the first piece. People don't really know about this. How many people have heard of grit or mindset before they came in this room? Yeah, maybe half. That's more than normal. Normally I say it and people are like, what? So people don't really know what it is. So starting to have that conversation, talking about it, giving those definitions, and talking about the goal setting, different types of goal setting, and the response patterns. Because I think if you just bring it into awareness, that alone people can start making changes with if they really want to. So that would be the first step. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I get you.
Do you think that this is some kind of experiment that like the environment could greatly affect the outcome of it? Because like I know everyone's talking about passion and stuff. Like obviously we're all sitting here, so when you're asking us about mindset, we're like, all right, what's our long-term goal? We all want to graduate. How passionate are we? Some of us just got here. Some of us just came back after being gone for 4 years. Like that's just how it is. But if you put a bunch of us in a room where we knew our next assignment was a project on a groundhog mating rituals, the mindset's gonna drop. Like, don't you think the environment could really affect somewhat the outcome?
I do. I think it does, and I think that's why it's not fixed. These kind of ebb and flow, you know, depending on environment a lot. But I think what stays pretty primary is if you keep that end goal in sight, some of the things that it takes to get there might be great and wonderful, and some of the things maybe not so much. And so how do you persist in the face of all of those things that come your way? So I think keeping that long-term goal in sight and knowing that you're ultimately passionate about whatever it is you're studying, even though maybe you're not passionate about every assignment that you have to do, right? So does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. You had a question?
Yeah, well, more towards the counseling, do you think that this model would help with the emotional side of it? Because I know that counselors often have to separate themselves a little bit, mainly just like not take home your work, basically.
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe having a better mindset and more grit would help with that in that
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, self-care is what we talk about. Like Lucky was saying, self-care we talk about to try to prevent burnout. So ultimately, you need that. You can't just have grit and mindset, and that would, you still have to take care of yourself. But what I do think is if you see the relationship between grit and mindset and counselor self-efficacy, we know that if you have a higher self-efficacy, that you're going to have better outcomes. So ultimately, it very much can help that emotional side. Does that make sense? Because it's all influencing counselor self-efficacy. Yeah. Yes?
Have you found a correlation between gender and self-efficacy? Because I think of my wife as a physician, and she gets a lot more pushback from her diagnoses than her male colleagues. My student assessments are artificially inflated from a male.
Yeah.
So the feedback you're getting that influences your efficacy in your job might be affected all by gender?
Gender was one of my demographics, but it did not influence the results at all. So I did look at that to make sure there were no confounding variables or things that were, influencing the relationship. I didn't look at that specifically with each variable with counselor self-efficacy, so I don't really know. But that would be interesting.
I was curious, similar about race and ethnicity, and wonder if folks of certain groups might be more resilient, have more grit than others, just based upon the situations in which they might find themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Rings true, particularly over the last.
Yeah. Implications for future research, truly. I mean, this was really just a starting point, and I love what you're saying. That is definitely something I've thought about and want to pursue. Any other questions? You are all a fantastic group. I appreciate you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is the Michael Jordan quote. Thank you for being here. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is just my last name @etsu.edu.